We've had a very intensive and fruitful day so far. It's always hard to be the act following lunch and the act following Larry Summers, but we will do our best. We're going to have a panel now on what questions are next to address, and my close colleague, our Executive Vice President, Director of Studies, and Head of Putting Up Name Cards, Dr. Marcus Noland, will be chairing the panel. So, Marcus, over to you.
Yes, here at Peterson, we pride ourselves on being able to multitask in omnidirections. I noticed earlier today when we had overflow and we needed additional infrastructure, our head of IT was down here, putting chairs up. My name is Marcus Noland. I am the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies here at Peterson, and it is a great honor to chair this final panel on looking forward to new questions. I think we could all agree we've had a very interesting symposium. I wouldn't go quite as far as my colleague Jacob Kierkegaard's agnosticism. Sitting here so far today, I actually have seen some fairly common themes. The idea that when examining total factor productivity, which is after all a residual, and as a residual, it's not entirely surprising that attempts to analyze it could get a little squishy. As Larry Summers very forcefully argued in the previous session, there may be a potential role for significant mismeasurement. So we've got a basic mismeasurement issue that may vary in intensity across countries, but is conceptually probably uniform across them. Then we had a bunch of themes that kept on reoccurring: the increasing dispersion of rates of return to capital across firms, possibly declining or at least sort of stagnant labor mobility, questions about the role of rents, the idea that possibly extended periods of very low interest rates has contributed to the impaired or misallocation of resources, contributing to the observation of these increases in dispersion and performance in both labor and capital across firms. And then a bunch of country-specific idiosyncratic political economy issues that are significant for each of those economies, whether it be the healthcare sector in the United States, Chinese cronyism, or potentially unintended effects of the creation of the single currency. So I think we've got a very rich agenda, and the final panel will try to both summarize and extend it. I noticed that we have 4 speakers, and in a rush, let's see, I do have the bios here. At least I thought I had the bios here. Yes, indeed. 4 speakers in roughly alphabetical order. First, Daniel Andrews, who is a senior economist in the Structural Policy Analysis Division, the Policy Studies Branch, the Economics Department of the OECD. And I'm sure for most, if not all of you, know him as the person who really did the heavy lifting in this recent major study that the OECD put out on productivity across countries. Second is Jeremy Bentham, Shell Vice President for Global Business Environment, and as most of you know, person who really runs the famous Shell Scenarios project. I'm always very impressed. He studied physics and then went to Caltech. And so you have to be very careful with people like that. He really is a rocket scientist. Then, I'm not illiterate. I do understand the alphabet, but we're going to go to John Van Reenen from the London School of Economics, who, again, I'm sure is known to most, if not all of you, as someone who has done really interesting work on how the nature of firm ownership and management affects productivity and efficiency. And I'm sure he'll have something to say about that. And then finally, our dear leader, Adam Posen, the president of the Peterson Institute, a man who literally needs no introduction to this audience, who will conclude and provide a bit of a benediction at the end. I was originally going to invite everybody up and just kind of make it less formal and we can all just talk. But I noticed that Daniel actually has a PowerPoint. And so we would have all gotten up there and then just gone and sat back down again because we'd all be craning our necks. So I think the thing to do at this point is for me to stop talking, invite Daniel Andrews and his PowerPoint up, and then we can all go up to the stage. Thank you.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd just like to thank Adam for inviting me here again. It's great to be back. He hosted the launch of our book on the future of productivity in July, and we're really appreciative for that. So the reason I put together this PowerPoint today is I want to give you a bit of an insight into some of the work we've done at the OECD, which we think provides some insights into what's happening with productivity around the world. It doesn't answer all the questions by any means, but I still think it's informative. So, I think one of the issues this morning is that we learned is that if you want to understand productivity, you really need firm-level data. And so if you want to sort of explain why productivity slowed even before the crisis, there's a few different explanations. One is that basically growth at the global technological frontier has slowed. So this is a story about techno-pessimists versus techno-optimists in terms of slowing innovation. The second explanation is that maybe things are fine at the frontier. But the problem is that these ideas and innovations aren't spilling over and diffusing to other firms. And this is something that we call essentially the breakdown of the diffusion machine. And the third explanation is about rising resource misallocation, which we heard about this morning. So when we started this project a couple of years ago, and I should mention that it's a joint effort between a number of people at the OECD, we were quite attracted to the issue of the techno-pessimist, techno-optimist debate. And the thing is that when we got into this, we realized that we really didn't know anything about the characteristics of the firms that operate at the global frontier, let alone what's happened to their growth performance. So what we just tried to do is to try to learn something about these firms. And when you do that using harmonized cross-country firm-level data, a number of key characteristics emerge. Obviously, they're a lot more productive, but we also see they're larger, they're more profitable than other firms, they're more likely to patent, and they're more likely to be part of a multinational enterprise group. The other thing is that these frontier firms aren't just from the US. There's frontier firms evident in each sector, and they're from different countries. So that's another key insight. Now, given we're at the OECD, we care about identifying the effects of policies on productivities. And one of the problems here is that with the global frontier firms, which the debate has really focused on in terms of the techno-optimist, techno-pessimist debate, they're very global, so it's very difficult to think about how public policy influences their choices. On the other hand, however, our research shows that there's some strong linkages between the impact of public policies, firstly on scope for diffusion and also resource misallocation. And this is much more significant than policy's effect on the frontier. And the second point to note is that number 2 and number 3 are probably linked in a sense. We have some research to show that technological diffusion is a lot more difficult in environments where resources are misallocated. And a key component of this is the mismatch of between skills and jobs. So what we did here is we got this cross-country harmonized firm-level data, and within each 2-digit sector, we tried to identify basically the global frontier. And the upshot is you can cut the data a number of ways, but this chart here looks at the 100 most productive firms in the world in each 2-digit sector. Then what we do is we aggregate the data, average it simply across manufacturing and services. And one of the things to note is that despite the slowdown in aggregate productivity, we see here that productivity growth at the frontier remained relatively robust through this sample period. So for instance, in the manufacturing sector, we're looking at annual average growth of about 3.5%. And this compares to a growth rate of around 0.5% for other firms. And this divergence here is even bigger in the services sector, which is a smoking gun in a sense, because we know that services is less exposed to international competition, and regulations tend to be a lot more stringent there. So one of the limitations of this analysis is we only had the firm-level data for the 2000s. So a legitimate question here is, has this always been the case, or has something changed? And what we've done is some more recent analysis using industry-level data from the mid-1980s. And what we see is that through much of the 80s and 90s, the frontier isn't growing much more than the non-frontier observations. However, something changes in the early 2000s, which is consistent with what we see here. So obviously there's a number of explanations for this. One is that technological diffusion has slowed, and this might be consistent with some research by Diego Common, who shows that when you look across countries, the adoption lags with respect to new technologies have actually fallen over time. However, we see much bigger divergences in the long run penetration rates of technologies. So that suggests that not all firms get it, and there's barriers to technological diffusion. Another explanation is what we heard about this morning in terms of these winner-take-all dynamics. So this would be a story about the interaction between digitalization and globalization that leads the technological leaders to pull away from everyone else. And I think there's some really interesting work to do here in the context of the presentation this morning by Peter Orszag. And then finally, maybe there's something about some intangible qualities here that the frontier firms have, in that the replication and diffusion of this magic bundle has become more difficult over time. So this might be related to an example, for instance, where the complementarities between, for instance, new technologies and managerial capital have intensified over time. But obviously John knows a lot more about this than I do. So I should note that these patterns I show here are robust to a number of different things. We can do it in terms of labour productivity, TFP. The slides are in the back of the presentation. You can change the definition of the frontier to look at the top 50 firms. You can do it in terms of percentages. You don't escape the conclusion that the most productive firms have pulled away from the rest of the pack. It's relatively broad-based across industries, and it doesn't really depend on survival bias in our sample. So in terms of what we want to do in the future with respect to diffusion is we want to update this analysis. So we've got our hands on some new data here, which will take us before the 2000s and also after the crisis. So that's the first thing to do, is to update the data. And also we want to work on sort of more the links between policy and diffusion. So the key question is, if diffusion did really stall, why did it happen in the early 2000s? And admittedly, we don't have a good explanation for this at the moment, because in a sense, a lot of the policy variables are going in the wrong direction. There's been a move towards liberalisation, yet diffusion may have stalled. So that's a tough one. But so what can explain the timing? Well, there may be something about these technological factors. Or maybe there's something to do with policy weakness or institutional weaknesses that's thwarting the scope for diffusion. And there's a few things we want to look at here. One is the potential that IPR regimes are creating barriers to entry here. And we know that new entrants are often the enablers of new technology. One of the things we do see in the cross-country industry data is that the productivity gaps between the frontier and other firms are much larger in those sectors that have high entry and exit in countries that have very strong patent protection. So this could suggest that, in certain dynamic emerging knowledge-based capital sectors, the IPR regimes may be acting as a barrier to entry. The second explanation is a more generalised one about competition and barriers to entry. In the case of the European Union, this could be about fragmentation in the market for services. But more specifically, this could be a story about vested interests, and lobbying, blocking the penetration of new technologies. So, you could think of Uber being an example here, and how there's been a lot of backlash from incumbents in that respect. And then finally, I think this link between rising wage inequality and rising productivity dispersion is also interesting. In the sense that most of the increase in inequality is between firms, and yet we also see a big between firm increase in productivity. Secondly, just in terms of misallocation, so one of the things that struck me about Shevden's paper is that most of the evidence we have of misallocation is cross-sectional, and this is really special to see something that looks at the evolution of misallocation over time. So I think that's really important. Some things we're thinking about is misallocation in market services. So Shevden's paper is about manufacturing, but we know services are less exposed to international competition, and there's potential more scope for misallocation there. We have some evidence, albeit tentative, that misallocation is a lot higher in services than manufacturing, and this would be interesting to look at how that's evolved over time. The other thing that we're just starting on now is looking at capital misallocation in more detail, and this issue of zombie firms and the link with declining business dynamism in OECD countries. This is a generalised phenomenon across countries in terms of declining startups. And one thing we're concerned about is that the creative destruction mechanisms in the economy are breaking down, and small and old inefficient firms are increasingly surviving in the market, which clogs up resources and prevents more innovative firms from growing. One of the interesting things, particularly about Southern Europe, when I think about Shevlin's paper, is that we see rising capital misallocation there, but we know that countries like in Spain and in Italy, policy-induced exit costs are very high. So, for instance, the cost to close a business in Italy is very high. There's issues with the bankruptcy law system in Spain where basically everyone wants to avoid it because it's so punitive. So one question, I guess, is what's the link between institutions and rising capital misallocation over time? And one thing we're trying to do here is collect sort of better indicators of public policy with respect to bankruptcy. And then another issue which links to Changtai Heshe's work is this misallocation across cities. We have some work at the OECD that looks at housing policies, and we collect cross-country data, for instance, on rental regulations and transaction costs in housing, and we tend to see significant differences here. And these regulations in housing markets tend to really affect residential mobility. And so we want to sort of think more about how that's affecting the allocation of resources across cities. One thing we do have some evidence from our government department of the OECD is that this increasing productivity dispersion is also evident across cities in the OECD, not just firms. So that's something we want to follow up on. And then finally, we want to do some more work on the misallocation of skills. So we heard a lot about capital misallocation today, but we have some evidence from the OECD survey of adult skills, which shows that something like 1/4 of workers in OECD countries are either overskilled or underskilled, and it's mainly overskilling. And this tends to be very strongly correlated with the policy environment, particularly housing market distortions, which constrain residential mobility. And one of the things we do is we match this mismatched data to productivity data, and we see essentially in sectors of higher skill mismatch, you see a lot lower productivity. And the key channel here is that we see that human talent tends to be trapped in inefficient firms, which creates a constraint on growth for the more productive firms. This also tends to sort of slow down diffusion. So this is just an indicator of skill misallocation across countries. So the red bar is essentially the proportion of workers who are either overskilled or underskilled. This is mainly overskilling that's at play here. We see that it ranges from about 20% up through around sort of 30% in Italy. And one of the things we do is we try to simulate the potential gains to productivity from reducing skill mismatch. And so, for instance, in Italy, if Italy could reduce skill mismatch to the best practice level in each industry in the OECD, that would be associated with a 10% increase in labour productivity. And that can, roughly in our sample, explain about 1/5 of the gap in allocated efficiency between Italy and the USA. So I'll leave it there. If you want to read more about our report, it's called The Future of Productivity, which I did with Muga Adelaide McGowan, Chiara Criscuolo, and Giuseppe Nicoletti. Thanks a lot.
Because we're the non-PowerPoint. Oh, no, you have a PowerPoint, right? You have a PowerPoint.
Oh, no. But in your case, it's really good because it's so comprehensive.
Okay. Actually, can I suggest we break order even more since he has a PowerPoint and Jeremy and I don't?
Okay.
Please.
We also pride ourselves on our flexibility here at the Peterson Institute. Non-bureaucratic.
Okay. Perfect. Okay, so apologies for the PowerPoint. I should also say, when I thought I was going last, I was very aware that I would be the person between you and cocktails. So that was a very strong incentive for me to be short and sweet. But fortunately, that task has been aided because there's been so many great presentations already this morning. A lot of the stuff I was planning to cover has already been covered. So I'll go pretty quickly through some of the earlier parts of the slides and maybe spend a little bit more time on some of the future questions which I was tasked with. So, if there's one message to take away from what I'm going to say, it's that when we think about productivity, we should be not just thinking about fancy technologies, we should also be thinking about people like this. So there's a few characters here who are from managers from various fictional and non-fictional places. Two of them are currently auditioning for to be CEO of that organization, otherwise known as the United States of America, We have two potential presidential candidates there, as well as several other managers. So I want to talk about why productivity growth has been disappointing in recent years, what can be done, and what are some of the big future issues in thinking about productivity. David Ramsden gave a fantastic talk on what the UK position is. This is just to show you exactly what he was saying. If you look at where the UK is in terms of GDP per hour, and you just looked at the kind of trend from 1979, before the eve of the Great Recession, UK productivity output per hour is something like 14% below where we would have expected. So that's a huge gap. And as he also said, if you compare that with other countries, you also see similar gaps. But the gap in the UK, that's the difference between the bottom purple line and the top dashed line, is much larger than it is for other OECD countries. So, the specific things for the UK and also some general lessons on productivity. So, the UK has had this enormous shock, like many other countries in the world. We've actually had the slowest recovery of GDP in 100 years. I think David didn't emphasize this. I would emphasize, one factor here is related to the speed of fiscal austerity we had, especially in the 2010 to 2012 period when public investment was cut very dramatically. And as he mentioned, part of the response to that, and this is different in the UK and other countries, is that the labour market actually helped mitigate some of the shock. So in particular, in the UK, real wages have fallen by something like 10% between 2008 and 2014. That's very different from earlier recessions in the UK. Typically, like other countries, typically real wages don't fall much in a recession, whereas they did in the last recession. And I think, broadly speaking, that's because in the UK there's been a series of policy reforms, significant weakening of unions, but also a much more active welfare system, combination of making people look harder for jobs and also having a kind of tax credit system, which has meant that people remained attached to the labour force. So unemployment did not rise as much as it did in the US, and the participation rate, which as Larry and other people have mentioned, fell a lot. Actually has recovered completely in the UK. So the employment rate now is pretty much what it was before the recession. So this combination of kind of cheap labour plus the financial crisis, the credit crunch, effectively meant there was kind of labour capital substitution. So there was very low investment rates, and this led to flattening of capital investment, which has fed through into lower productivity. So this is the real wage fall, this is the employment rate holding up, and this is the kind of capital per hour where you can see it has completely been flat over the last few years. So that's a major contribution to low productivity in the UK. In terms of the things I'd emphasize, demand is important. So the initial shock was certainly part of what happened. Some people, how can this continue since obviously there's some recovery? Well, the UK is still affected by the ongoing Eurozone crisis. Half of all UK exports is the Eurozone. Austerity is remaining very tough, and there are the hysteresis effects, which can of cause persistent effects like capital scrapping. On the supply side, the banking sector, bad debts have not been fixed as quickly as the US. So I think that is an important part, both of misallocation and failing to get enough capital for investment. I find the kind of the technology slowdown argument rather unconvincing. Maybe Bob will convince me over dinner tonight. But I find the idea that suddenly that the UK is 14% stupider, or IQs have kind of dropped by that amount. I find that rather implausible. Some part of it may be that, but I don't think technology can be the major reason for what's happening. Okay, so let me talk a bit more about future issues. I think this issue of intangible capital actually is pretty critical in terms of where we do our research, looking at productivity. So Carol Carrada, Chuck Holton, and Sickle have emphasized that if you don't take into account many of the hard things to measure about capital, then it's likely we're going to both mismeasure TFP. The direction of that effect we know could be ambiguous, but in principle it could be part of the slowdown we observe. There's two broad types of intangible capital we can think of. One, the thing that I've, in my own research I've focused on when I was a grad student and in my early research was all on technological innovation. So information technology, computers, research development, IP. I still think those are really important. But as I said in my second slide, I actually think this other category, this broader view of economic competencies, in particular management practices, are really important in terms of thinking about productivity. So let me just share a few of these ideas with you. This comes from work which I've done with Nick Bloom in Stanford and Rafael Assadon, who is at Harvard. We call this the World Management Survey. So in the World Management Survey, we have this method, which originally we helped develop, was developed jointly with McKinsey and other consultancies, to try and survey firms to measure some of the core management practices. So these are basic things around the collection of data, monitoring, setting targets, how you deal with your people in terms of hiring and firing. It's not the kind of highfalutin kind of leadership things or innovation things that you'd learn at business schools. It's actually much more basic things. How can I do what I'm doing at the moment, but do it more effectively? So we've done this in a number of sectors, for manufacturing, health, retail, other sectors, in 4 major waves across 34 countries. And if you're interested in the details, go to the World Management Survey website. We have all the data up there. It's open source, the methods, and all the gruesome details you might be interested in. What we find when we look at the cross-country average management scores, it's kind of what you might expect. So, these are the rankings on the average management quality scores. And they broadly look what you might expect from looking at cross-country TFP or cross-country productivity measures. So countries like the United States do very well, as do Germany and other kind of very, very Sweden, countries like that. The kind of southern European countries in the middle, emerging countries like China and India further down, and African countries near the bottom of the league. But to a kind of microeconomist like me, I'm much more interested in what's happening underneath these macroeconomic aggregates. And as many people have emphasized, if you really want to understand what's happening in productivity, you really have to go to the firm level. So if you look at every country, what this shows you is the distribution of management scores in every country in the world across firms. So, you see this kind of bell-shaped thing, and most firms have average management scores, but then in every country there's really well-managed firms, and every country there's really badly managed firms. So there's a lot of heterogeneity. So if you think about countries like the US versus India, it's not like every single US firm is awesome and getting really high management scores. There are also really good firms in India, but there's also really bad firms in the US. This left tail, these are firms which are not collecting any information on what's going on inside the firms. They're not promoting people based on merit. They're not dealing with underperformers. But economists is a wonder why these firms could exist. But, experience of now working with many firms and talking to them shows you that every country in the world has some bad firms. The difference, say, between India and the US is that there is a very long tail in India of badly managed firms, which you don't really see so many of in the US. So that immediately makes you think of competition as one of the critical forces here. If you look at the relationship of management and productivity at the firm level, this is across about 10,000 firms. Very strong positive correlation between management and TFP. And we've been running randomized control trials all over the world now in places like India, which shows that the majority of this relation is actually a causal relation. It's not just a correlation. Does this matter in terms of thinking about productivity? Well, this is the kind of TFP gap with the US. So the far right, you've got the US normalized as 1, and this just shows you the gap that every country has with the US. And then we do a calculation which is to say, well, given our measures of management, how much of this gap can we explain using some of the causal impacts on management and TFP? And it turns out, on average, we can account for something like 30% of the TFP gap between the US and other countries with these type of management measures. Now, this is a very crude calculation, requires lots of assumptions, but it does suggest that a non-trivial fraction of some of the productivity differences we see are actually related to the way that firms are organized and managed, which I think suggests we need to take this very seriously in terms of thinking about productivity. Now, that's the levels. This conference is about growth. Can management explain the growth of productivity? Well, one interesting fact is that the European Union didn't enjoy this big acceleration of productivity growth that John Fernald showed us happened in the US from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. And I think plausibly one of the reasons for that, since the technology of ICT was available everywhere, is that in lots of European countries, weaker product market competition, lots of labour market regulation has meant that it was much harder to introduce the type of management practices that I've described. And if those were complementary with new ICT, if you introduce a lot of new information technology, you might need to reorganize your workforce. That might be held back in many European countries. And we show a lot of evidence that that's the case by looking at the microdata. So in this paper with Nick and Raffaella, we estimate that maybe half of the slower EU productivity performance was related to the worse kind of management practices in Europe relative to the US, which made it harder for European firms to pick up on the technological advances in the US. So that's the kind of picture. This just shows you the productivity problems in Europe predated the crisis, as Sebnem talked about, and the fall of productivity growth has been faster in Europe than it has in the US. Okay, so just to conclude, I want to argue that the slower productivity growth that the crisis had hit some countries a lot harder than others. I think labour market flexibility helped. I think the unsupportive fiscal policy in the UK, as in many other countries, didn't. But as the problem goes on, we have to look at the puzzle remains. It's not simply demand. There's also some supply issues. But more fundamentally, I want to argue when we think about productivity changes, we really have to take this role of intangible seriously, not just for kind of hard technologies like computers or research and development, but also for things we might think of softer technologies, such as management practices. And I think one question, this might come up in the Q&A, is, well, why is it that some firms and some countries are so much slower at adopting management practices than others? So what are the barriers to that, and what could policy do to speed up the diffusion of better management practices, not just better technologies? Thank you.
Third time's a charm.
This time we really mean it. John.
Oh, thank you.
Right, so. Great. Is this on? I can't tell, yeah. It's got a green light on. Don't have a PowerPoint, so if those of you who know my company, we've been talking about firm-specific experience, will know that it's very, very difficult for me to speak without a PowerPoint. But I'll do my best to do so. It's been great to have these conversations that have been going on about economic activity and the frontier. And it kind of helps us as a company to grapple a little bit with what is the landscape, what are the main features, and what are the main uncertainties. And that's important for us as a company. Shell is an energy company, and economic activity is what shapes the nature and the quantity of energy demand. So we're very thrilled to be part of this gathering. This session is about what are the next questions? And we've got a long history, I guess, going back almost 50 years, of trying to grapple with these kinds of questions by developing scenarios. And I have the privilege, as was mentioned, of being the head of the scenario activity in the company, part of the global the strategy leadership team. And it's fair to say, as will become obvious to you very shortly, that any expertise there is outside the head. You've already heard many intelligent questions from my colleagues who are here, and we rely on these kinds of gatherings and engagements to help bring the intellectual content to the work that we're doing. Naturally, because of the timescales of our industry and the length of impact that our investments have, we look out often over many decades, 50 years, even 100 years if you're looking at the environmental impact. To do that, you need at least a plausible economic foundation around economic activity. So we have an underlying model that we use, which is very, very familiar to most, I think, around economic convergence towards an evolving frontier of productivity and technology. And so both the frontier and convergence are important for us. really do recognize that there are critical uncertainties, for instance, in that convergence story. And so within that, as we look forward with our currently published scenarios, we have consideration of the middle income trap, that recognition that many economies that have been thought likely in the past to reach a certain threshold get stuck. But also that you have the history of acceleration, where economies that perhaps used to take a century or half a century to reach certain levels of economic activity have seen deltas, with South Korea taking 25 years, and China and India, things happening in 10 years. And so one of the questions we have, and I'll come back to, is that kind of model, as you're looking towards the long term, still helpful for grappling with the understanding of how economic activity is going to develop across the world over decades? Now, as a business, we recognize that the role that we play as kind of part of the engine that's intended to maintain and even expand a decent quality of life around the world. And at this time, there are really two imperatives within that. First of all, that development imperative. What does it mean to be able to spread a decent quality of life from the minority to the majority? And secondly, as part of that decent quality of life, clearly there has to be a safeguarding of the environment. You really have to achieve this and achieve it with a state of what I'll refer to as net zero emissions, whether those are local emissions or whether those are in fact greenhouse gas emissions. So you're not going to get a stable safeguarding of the environment without net zero emissions. So we have to be grappling with questions around both growth and change. And that's fine. As a company, growth and change are the characteristics that enable a company to find value-generating opportunities. Now, in general, we understand well the links between different types of economic activity and the energy that's required to fuel that. So the question then that we have is it feasible to have enough economic activity in the world that can generate a decent quality of life for the majority and to have net zero emissions and to achieve that this century? And I think our conclusion is that it's, forgive the language, it's bloody challenging, but it is feasible. So that is a feasible outlook. What does that mean for both development and the mix in the energy industry? Well, first of all, perhaps it's kind of helpful to get your minds around, to get our minds around how much energy is required to kind of support the activity that brings a decent quality of life. So here in the US, round about, in geek terms, 300 gigajoules per capita per year is that kind of amount of energy that is used in the United States. And that's equivalent to every man, woman, and child in the United States having 300 physical laborers working for them. So that's kind of why people here live like pharaohs compared to the historical realities. And in Europe, it's about 150, so a more efficient energy economy. In Japan, also about 150. So perhaps if you kind of look at it and really focus on where you can bring efficiencies, you can get by with about the equivalent of 100 laborers working for you. And with about 10 billion people on the planet towards the end of the century, that gives you around about a doubling of the size of the current energy system. So whatever we're looking at, we're having to ask questions about the amount of economic activity and doubling the size of the energy system. So then let's look at this question of mix. And so how do you get to net zero emissions? How do you actually get there? It's easy to kind of talk about it, Well, clearly, renewables are going to play a major role in that. But they're not going to be a silver bullet. You see, because renewables, most people these days are thinking about solar and wind, and they produce electricity. And electricity accounts for around about a fifth of global energy consumption. I think here in the United States, it's also about a fifth of the energy consumption. And so if renewables are going to play a bigger and bigger role in society, you're actually going to have to talk about deeper and deeper electrification of the economy. And so we estimate that you can move that towards around about 50 to 60% of the economy. But there's real challenges. Some things are very straightforward, such as the residential sector. Now, in some countries, that means basically entering every home and changing the central heating system of the households, and there may be some political difficulties with that, but it's basically technically feasible. City electric vehicles, whether those are battery electrics or fuel cell electric vehicles, that's kind of quite foreseeable. You can see that. But long-distance, heavy-duty transport where you need energy-dense fuels, much more difficult. And then you get into sectors where you need furnaces, where you have sectors such as iron and steel and cement, where actually part of the physical and chemical processes require emissions, bring you emissions. And so there are some things that are very, very difficult and come to the point of being more or less impossible. And so you can see that this world is going to have some sectors that are going to be slower than others, and some countries that are going to be slower than others. So you're going to need technologies, new technologies like carbon dioxide capture and storage, and combine that with land use, the use of vegetation matter, biofuels, etc., to have negative emissions to offset that. And hence you're going to need whole sets of policies that drive those kinds of technologies, either putting a price on emissions, but also driving the circumstances for particular technologies. Also, it's very easy to get caught up in the fact that there are low-hanging fruit. And so many of the developments that you need to take you on a trajectory, you can see what can happen over the next 10 years. I think David earlier mentioned the Infrastructure Commission in the UK. One of the things we recognise from the UK is you can follow the kinds of trajectories that you're looking for the next 10 or 15 years. But then you run into a wall unless you're doing some other things already to take that forward beyond that. And that's a discussion we might pick up at another time. But it happens everywhere. So then, if we can get our minds around that really difficult problem, we can get our minds around it, can we get our minds around the development questions? And there, again, will betray the fact that I'm not a scholar, and certainly not in your profession. But what are the links between medium-term growth potential for those emerging, developing economies and the performance of the advanced economies? Is convergence still the right paradigm to have there? What are the transition or the transmission mechanisms for growth and for shocks? Does it mean anything that most of the real output in the world is going to be concentrated or coming from emerging economies when the financial markets are dominated by the advanced economies? Does that mean anything? What role does activity at the frontier, the productivity frontier and the technology frontier play in this? And so finally, you are all fantastic representatives of the economics profession, whether you're from the academic side or the policy side. What contribution can your profession make to realizing what I actually find to be really quite, well, personally, an inspiring prospect? That prospect of a world in which the majority of people can enjoy and achieve a decent quality of life, and achieve that with net zero emissions. So these are the kinds of questions I'd like to just kind of leave behind, and hopefully the next type of research programs and thought programs that you have in mind will begin to address those kinds of questions. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, Mark. I spared John being last so that A, I could free ride even further on what he said, B, so that I could be the one to break to you the news that you're going to have to go buy your own cocktails, and C, because as Mark said, I want to be able to give a sort of benediction or at least say grace and thank you at the end. But first, let me give my shot on the questions. And I have a list of 10 questions, which is revealing, because when you know what the answer is, you always pose 3 questions and make sure it's clear which one you like. If you're not sure what the answer is, you pose 10 questions, because then you hope 2 or 3 of them, as in baseball, land for hits. And so let me do it that way. But let me start off where I think John started off, where obviously I was asking Larry to consider things. I mean, we have had to consider, and we will in our data work constantly have to consider, how much the slowdown is accelerated by, is a coincidence with the recession. John put it as in the UK, you didn't believe that everyone got stupider. The way I put it when I was at Bank of England was British workers didn't wake up one day and their left arms had all fallen off. You know, there is a basic question as to why things get worse immediately in a financial crisis. We can tell lots of stories about the damage done by capital misallocation, by asset collapses, by workers being put out of work, but why there's an immediate effect is harder. And that goes to something I think Dan Andrews was saying, and that I think was why I asked John Fernald to start the conference, is that the time series does matter. Dating things precisely is always going to be a bit of a game, but I think it is very important that this conference proceeded, not just because of John, but in part thanks to John, with lots of other evidence suggesting the productivity slowdown or the reversion to long-term productivity trend, that's something we can get back to, did start before the crisis. And so while we had some people saying or implying that the crisis made things worse and some people saying or implying the crisis had nothing to do with it, we had nobody who was implying that the productivity slowdown was totally due to the crisis. And I think that that's the important place we have to start. So if we start, and which is of course different than where I hoped I was when I talked about left arms falling off, because if that was the case, we could get it all back, or at least we could get it all back if we acted enough in a short enough time. And that's clearly not what was happening. So let me raise a few issues. My first question is, has there really been any reordering of which countries or which types of firms are at top in these rankings? I mean, we had a nice chart from Dave taking OECD data, and I'm sure Daniel has a version of it, in which you can see the whole array of TFP downshifts. But essentially, the ordinal ranking of countries doesn't really change very much. Germany and the US sort of remain at top. That hasn't changed very much over the years. And it's kind of interesting that whatever this was doesn't seem to have shaken up the rankings very much. Now, the easy way out of that is to say, well, there's some broad sense in which countries are more or less liberalized. And I think the work of McKinsey Global Institute sort of goes down that road. And you just sort of say, well, whatever the nature of the shock was, they all transmit the shock differently, and those that transmit it badly in the past will transmit it badly now. I'd like to see maybe some more work done on whether these ordinal rankings really make sense and whether that's really a robust result, because I'm not sure about that. Second, I think, and again, I think it was Daniel who talked about this, it is interesting that we talked very little about labor today. We talked an awful lot about capital misallocation. We talked about labor in the sense as an outcome that some of us were worried about long-term unemployment or just broadly about the negative feedback about long-term unemployment to mismatch. But we didn't really talk much about labor. There was a little bit in Peter Orszag's talking about sorting, and we talked a little bit about the best bus drivers going to be driving the buses that Google uses to San Francisco rather than driving the DC buses, certainly. But again, there's a cross-sectional aspect there that's very interesting, as was particularly pointed out by Dave Ramsden, but was also true in Marcel Fratscher's discussion, and my colleague Jacob Kierkegaard's written about in the past. We've actually seen labor force participation go up in a number of countries that aren't the U.S. Now, it's not quite the same thing as Larry Summers' point about low-skilled males in particular getting dropped out. I take his point about a long-term frequency issue versus a shorter-term frequency issue. But still, there are been some interesting developments in the labor market that don't neatly map up with this idea of it's a broad technological shock that is labor augmenting or labor non-augmenting across the board. And so I think some of the discussion of labor differences, I think, has to be done. Third, obviously, given where I sit, I do want to endorse what Larry said and others by omission implied, that this isn't caused by globalization. I mean, the easiest argument to make that the productivity slowdown is a globalization problem is to say, well, we seem to have slowed down, again, pick a number, pick a date, but it happened to be around the time that Eastern Europe and China got integrated in the world economy. And that's problematic, first because the timing doesn't really seem to hold up very well. It's problematic because we're not seeing so much the shift of high value-added employment to these countries, and we're not seeing explosion of manufacturing jobs. As Larry pointed out, as our colleague Robert Lawrence published with us a couple of years ago, a study, manufacturing employment is down everywhere that allows any competition. It is a technological thing. It's not you need fewer people to run blast furnaces, whether they're in South Korea, Nord Rhine-Westfalen, or in Hunan province, China. And so the idea that it's a pure globalization shift seems odd. But then we get into the work of Chang and Sebnem and their co-authors, which says that there is a very different model out there, that some of these patterns are not the same as in the U.S. I think Sebnem was most pointed on that. Chang was, of course, saying, there's a different political economy in China. So again, I can take heart that it doesn't sort of sequence with global integration, but there is this sort of basic confusion that everybody seems to have slowed down, but they seem to have slowed down for different reasons. That's Jacob's invocation that we all enjoy doing at one time or another, of Anna Karenina. They're each unhappy in their own way. But that's not very satisfying. Why then did it happen? So I think there's also, in addition to time series, there remains something unexploited yet in the panel, in the cross-sectional differences, which is why I'm so grateful to have had the cross-sectional panel that we did and the perspectives we've had. Fourth, I think we didn't directly grapple with the idea, is it all technology or not? Because, and again, Robert Gordon unfortunately couldn't be with us during the day today, but there is a sense in which one can just say, well, we've had technological regress, leave John and Adam out of it. However educated and however many arms people have, if the technologies don't improve, then you don't get growth in productivity. It may not lead to decline, but you don't get growth. And I'm not sure we've done anything today to kill that idea. I don't like it, but I think we've done a lot we need to do more about why some of the firm level explanations that Peter's paper, that Daniel and his colleagues' work, that John and her colleagues' work, why that sort of discredits that it's not just technology, or your management stuff. It's not just technology. And I'm not sure we're there yet. Fifth, just to get on a hobby horse, and this came up a bit with Larry Summers' point, if we're coming to a world in which we're saying that, whether or not it's totally technology, we have asymmetric business cycles, there isn't a fixed long-run trend, that shocks to technology matter quite a bit in the short run, that starts sounding like what I was taught back in the late 80s, early 90s as real business cycle theory, and which I assumed was completely wrong, and which the policy prescriptions in response to the Great Recession were demonstrably completely wrong. But if we start moving to a world in which it is, instead of business cycles, we see economies moving due to exogenous productivity shocks, then we have to go back through and rethink that contradiction as well. Then it's not absolutely necessary, but it's a little weird that you have Keynesian policy impacts, particularly on the fiscal side, but also the monetary side, in a world in which you're being driven by productivity shocks short term and there isn't a huge cyclicality. Now, that gets into levels of macroeconomic theorizing I'm not capable of doing, but I think we at least have to look at that. 6, in a similar spirit, we all of us now poo-poo the great moderation. That wonderful term that was created for what was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s in the US. But if you go back and you take semi-seriously what was written at the time, some of the things that were most interesting about the Great Moderation weren't mere braggadocio from my friends in the central banking community. They were about the idea that we had lower macroeconomic volatility writ large, and as a result, we had more inter-firm volatility. So you go back to some of the good papers. There was an NBR macro annual paper, I'm trying to remember. There was the paper by Meg McConnell and Gabriel Perez, anyway, Spanish name I can't pronounce. And the idea was, because sort of a Lucas model, we've reduced the amount of uncertainty and noise for people to discern what's going on, so firms are being paid much closer to their marginal product, and you can better determine who's a good firm and who's a bad firm, and investments are less crowded by all this general noise. And so that, in some ways, is consonant with what we've heard today about the emphasis on firms and firm quality, but in another sense, that was supposed to lead to very stable macroeconomic outcomes. There was an assumption that passed through, that it fed back the other way, that you had lower macroeconomic shocks, which led to better rewarding and identification of who was a good business and who wasn't, and that in turn would feed back and lead to a more stable economy. And that last part seems to have been wrong. 7th, everybody has to promote their own thing, so I'm going to promote my thing. A few years ago, and this goes to Jeremy's questions or issues about convergence. I know nothing about technology despite being the child of physicists, so I did a series of lectures a few years ago in which I talked about the old normal, and I suggested we were going back to the late 19th century, and my colleagues at Shell have heard versions of this from me at various times. And one of the key things about the late 19th century is, because of both geopolitical uncertainty and eroding intellectual property rights globally, you had faster convergence of the catch-up countries to the frontier and slower frontier. I mean, in short, what happens is the leader, the US, is feeling more threatened by China and others, becomes more miserly about providing global public goods. The Chinese and others are better able to catch up because they're less deterred from stealing intellectual property, the same way the US stole intellectual property from the UK 250 years ago. And you end up with a situation where the lead country provides fewer and fewer public goods because it feels more constrained and threatened, and the advantages at the lead diminish, and you get faster convergence at a slower rate. And that is an explanation, or at least a theory, that has absolutely nothing to do with anything we talked about today. And so maybe it's a compliment, maybe it's irrelevant, but just as an alternative perspective. Almost done, don't worry. It's also interesting today, except for one picture of managers from John and maybe a couple other illustrations people use, we didn't talk at all about demographics. And I'm kind of glad about that. Usually I'm the one in the room who feels that people sort of invoke demographics as the great boogeyman or boogie person, that whatever it is, we can explain the residual by demographics. So Japan is in deep trouble because it's too old. How do we know it's too old? They don't invest enough. They're not willing to take risks. Why do they do that? Because it's demographics, and it just ends up this circular labeling of the residual. So usually I'm the one who says, good, forget demographics. But the fact that we didn't mention it at all seems a little odd. And if we want to talk about something that was true across countries, across sectors, particularly in the rich world, it obviously is the aging of society. And it happens to fit with a US and a UK who are more demographically vital than a Japan or a Western Europe. Now, this may be a proxy for something else. It may not be age. As my colleague Marcus Nolan at the other end of the table has done in various work he's done on growth, various things that we think of as direct effects may not be that they are really representations of how open, how liberal in the Economist magazine sense your society is. And so the countries that are more open to various forms of childbirth and immigration may have maybe indicators of other willingness to adapt to new ideas. I don't know, but it was striking we didn't talk about demographics at all. Finally, two last, much briefer questions. One thing that I've never understood about the slowdown, and which was particularly frustrating when I was at Bank of England, is I hear people, including the Honorable Professor Summers, say, you know, well, if you're doing a project that you can only do at 1% interest rates, God, imagine how bad that project is. Why aren't you doing it 1.5%? The problem I have with this is the mystery isn't why people are doing bad projects. The mystery is why people aren't doing good projects. So we've driven down interest rates, and presumably we assume the universe of good projects to be done. This relates to some of the work Marcel's done in the German context. The universe of positive net present value projects is not determined by what the central bank or the market interest rate is. It exists, okay? There's stuff out there that should be invested in. There's ideas out there worth developing. There's capital worth installing. There's infrastructure worth building. And even if you can afford to do the lousy project when interest rates are low, the hurdle rate and the returns for getting the good project remains still much higher than for the low project. So we need an answer not just for why are people investing in lousy things? It's why are they investing in lousy things rather than good things if we assert that there are still good things out there to be invested in. If we decide there's nothing good out there to be invested in, then we're back to real business cycle and the problem's solved. But the idea that somehow low interest rates compel you to invest in lousy stuff as opposed to good stuff has never made any sense to me. I still don't understand it. Finally, and I think as much as everybody today has made huge contributions, for me, the paper that made the most difference was sort of Peter Orszag's playing off his work with Jason Furman, which is more about inequality, as he said, but I think partly because it resonated with so much other work everybody else has done, and about the firm-level dynamics, and about looking how it's a question of, and of course, again, Daniel's work with his colleagues at the OECD, John's work with his colleagues, John Morane's work at MGI. I mean, again, everybody here almost was focused on the firm level, and I think that was very productive. I think it's really interesting to link this up with, as I've said, there's work in the trade area about superstars. I've mentioned my colleague Carolyn Freund's work. Another colleague, Brad Jensen, has done work on, you know, you get out into global competition, it's the best firms that succeed, it's the best firms that thrive and grow. So then we start asking the question, if that phenomenon is still going on, why is that leading to less good productivity outcomes than it used to? In fact, one could argue that that phenomenon, the winner-take-all phenomenon, is better, or at least more rewarded now than it was 30 years ago when we had a more closed global economy and less liberal societies and less competition from the emerging markets. And yet we seem to be getting less good results at the aggregate level. Now, you can say, well, that concentrates and you don't get diffusion, and I think there's something to that. But it's also kind of like what somebody was pointing out, I forget who, earlier about the labor supply, that if you're dropping out the lowest people, the average should rise. So there is something perplexing there as well. I'm very grateful to everyone. I turn it back to Mark in case anybody wants to ask questions, particularly of my distinguished colleagues sitting to my right since I've talked too long. But I think this has been an exciting discussion, and I hope we have food for future work.
Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes before our scheduled completion time. At the same time, looking out at the audience, I see a lot of glassy-eyed people. So let me make the following admonition. If you have a question, ask it. If you don't have a question, don't ask it. Jacob Kierkegaard.
Well, thank you very much. This is a question, and I really fed off the comments that Jeremy made of this concept of zero net emissions looking forward, because whatever you think about what's going to come out of the COP21 in Paris and all that, if we assert that we are in a world going forward where there are real climate change, environmental constraints, going forward. The question is, what implications does that have for productivity growth? And is there some sort of a global frontier in terms of the energy efficiency that you need to achieve to generate growth? Because if that's the case and if that's the implication, then given where the starting levels are, you'd probably want, do we want the US then to have twice the level of productivity growth than, say, Europe, simply because the starting point is that it spends twice as much energy to generate one unit of GDP? Is that the implication, or is this simply wishful thinking?
Why don't we collect a few questions? Antoine van Achmel and then Caroline Freund.
Two questions. First is, and any on the panel would probably be able to throw light on that, is productivity is really a residual. And, I find it very hard to imagine that 23 years after Solo first brought this up, it's still a residual. And so I wonder what the panel thinks about whether the current ability to use data analytics actually would make it possible to measure productivity more directly, particularly if you take the angle that Larry put forward, which is that it is somehow to do with the quality of how we measure inflation, which I think is a very fruitful area to go to. Second question is, when we look at productivity, I have not heard the word education at all. But productivity is a function to some extent of human capital. I think certainly in the United States, and this is a question, have we eroded human capital through the appalling inequality of education in such a way that it could have had a significant downward effect?
For those of you who are not from this immediate area, you may not know that Antoine and his wife have a foundation that basically supports education for disadvantaged children here in this area. Carolyn, and then Angel, do you have a question or just?
I just wanted to relate the slowdown in productivity to the slowdown in trade. So the other big phenomena that trade economists talk about is that it used to be the case that trade grew twice as fast as GDP, and then, over the exact same period, coincidentally, that productivity slowed down, trade is now growing about half as fast as GDP, global GDP growth. And people are doing the same kind of decompositions. Is it structural or is it cyclical? And looking into it myself and going back kind of a long period, I've come close to convincing myself that it's cyclical. Listening to this conference, I'm actually getting closer to convincing myself that the productivity slowdown is cyclical, because there's several pieces of, in Mark's looking at me confused, but actually that's what I take, not knowing much coming in here, that we saw that, productivity slowed down it was a common phenomena across many countries. We saw the graphs on UK that showed it happened pretty right with the crisis. In the US, it seemed to have happened a little bit earlier, but it is the residual after all. So what's the compelling piece of evidence that it's really more structural than cyclical? Because I'm just not convinced.
All right, Shabnam and then Angel.
I would like to go back to Adam and iterate on this issue of good projects, bad projects. So, I fully agree. Why the good projects out there are not being funded? Why are we, focusing on this, when the borrowing cost is very low, there are all these lousy projects being funded. But if you take a perspective of the last 30, 40 years, focusing on the emerging markets, each time there's an emerging market boom, when there are like growth rates of like 7 to 8%, it is really driven by the construction sector and the real estate. I mean, this is just the fact. So, and in those cases, I mean, you see that, there are a lot of, bad projects being funded in the construction sector, and then, turns out to be bust. But they are funded at the time because just the return is just so cheap and easy, right? So now it happens to Spain and other European countries. We are being shocked because these are deemed to be developed countries. They are not, Turkeys, Chinas, and Indonesias of the world. Oh, how can this happen? But this can happen anywhere because this is just human nature. You have a boom, and this construction sector and the real estate is the easy money-making place. So I don't think why we are being surprised in that sense. But I fully agree with you that why the good, the harder projects are not being funded. Again, I'm going to give an example from Turkey. The last 10 years, huge boom, 8% growth. It is completely driven by the construction. Construction of what? Houses in the third, fourth, fifth outskirt of Istanbul. When we probably need 2 more bridges, when we probably need a lot of infrastructure in a city like Istanbul. Uber, try to enter, and the only way they can enter is in the sub part of the city. They can't even fully, use the water, which is one of the things Istanbul can improve a lot. This is a good project, right? Why? Because water rights are monopolized. So it comes back again like the regulation and the markets, not just financial markets, but different markets, product markets, labor markets, and somehow these things not coming together, and every country is going through a phase of this. So I know that this is not going to give you one explanation, bringing US together with other countries, but I believe maybe in terms of the good projects being funded, the top ones are all funded, and then they are not, things like electricity, and maybe we are out of them, and all the others are marginal, and then they change with the cycle and with the country.
Okay. Was there a question in the front? Okay.
So all the firm level data makes me more optimistic and makes me more skeptical that this isn't at least largely cyclical. So first, why I'm generally optimistic is that it doesn't look like the production possibility frontier has shifted. It looks like it still exists. It looks like we still have good ideas. It's just only a small selection of firms are actually highly productive. So then going forward, you can imagine a couple of different ways this should go. Like if these firms have found very profitable investment opportunities, like Apple or Google, let's say, why aren't they expanding or replicating? Why aren't they taking over the entire distribution of firms? And one reason why they might not be is because they're waiting on the sidelines because of uncertainty, because they don't know what the economy is going to look like over the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and there's an option value in waiting. Or on the flip side, you might think that the reason that the bottom 80% of firms, let's say, have not done the same investments in order to get the same spectacular growth is because that same factor of uncertainty. So, I mean, the strong productivity gains that John Fernald showed us didn't come from productivity gains coming from, dropping from the sky. They came from firms making plans and doing investment and figuring out how to implement productivity gains. And, those cost money and take years in the making. So it could be that we just see the bottom 80% of firms sitting on the sidelines.
Okay. Okay, this is the last question.
Not so much it is a question in a way back to us, but I guess particularly to all of us, but particularly to people such as myself, and it links back to the emphasis, quite rightly, I think, put on education just now and on human capital, but also Adam's point that another emission, although Larry Summers referred to it kind of implicitly, was around demography, because he talked about health spending and measurement there. It does seem to me that given the challenges we face, whether cyclical or structural, whether over the kind of short time frequency the cycle, the more medium one that some of us use events like this to get into, or the rightly Jeremy has raised our sights to, we have to think longer term. Just how broad and deep the policy challenge is, and that comes back to the kind of political economy of whether there is the capacity. I mean, we've tried it in the UK with a very broad, wide-ranging and deep productivity plan, but we're trying lots of different things, recognizing both the range of challenges, but also the uncertainties around our understanding. But it does seem that it is a massive policy agenda. And then, of course, Adam raises our sights to the international aspect of it and trade and all of that. Anyway, so I think that should be inspiring to us, but it is also, it is huge as a challenge.
Thank you. So we have quite an extraordinary range of questions, and I guess my instructions to the panelists would be roughly the same as to the audience, which is if you have something to say, say it, but if you don't have something to say on a particular question, do not feel compelled. I will start with Dan Andrews and simply work our way down the panel. Dan.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll just make 2 points. So the first is about Caroline's question about what makes us think it's a structural slowing. So I guess the first thing is that we do see a slowdown before the crisis, and John's work, for instance, when you look at his TFP, like utilization adjusted measures of TFP, it's pretty convincing that this is something that happened before the big financial shock. The other thing is that over the course of the 2000s, before the financial crisis, we saw a slowdown in the structural drivers of productivity as well. So things like the rate of new entry of firms basically declined. We know that new firms have a comparative advantage in commercializing radical innovations, and they drive productivity growth. We also see a slowdown in knowledge-based capital investment before the crisis as well, things like R&D. So that sort of always made us think that there's something more to this slowdown than just the crisis. The second issue on education. And the link with inequality. So the OECD has some research that shows that it uses basically the outcome of people's skills. And essentially what you see is that children who grew up in countries and they were exposed to high rates of inequality during their formative education years tended to do a lot worse later on in terms of human capital accumulation and their actual skills at work. And this is particularly the case for people who grew up in the sort of bottom quartile of the income distribution. So I think there is a real challenge there in terms of the link between rising inequality and human capital accumulation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll just respond to the question that came up on emissions. As I said before, I'm not an economist, so I can't answer the question of how you should reconceptualize your economic understanding and your perceptions of economic activity. But I would say that you must do that because this needs to be considered. And I think there are 3 things that I would highlight around that. First of all, that to achieve that state of a stable economic impact on the environment, it's going to take some restructuring of every sector of the economy that consumes energy, i.e. every sector of the economy. Some of those are more straightforward than others, and often the ones that are technically straightforward are politically the most difficult. And so that's going to bring up challenges as well. And it's important, again, to recognize that there's a tail and a dog, and the focus at the moment is very much on the tail, which is the energy-producing companies like our own, whereas the bulk of the restructuring has to take place in the energy-consuming big dog. A point was raised about efficiency, and I think that is critical as well. And then it's about how do you bring in structural efficiencies. Cities were mentioned earlier in another presentation, compact cities, etc. Because without the ability to bring in those efficiencies, you can never achieve net zero emissions. So if the world was to converge at around 150 physical labor equivalent per person, then you'd have 3 times the size of the energy system as today, and there isn't enough biomass available to give you negative offsets for the remaining emissions that will inevitably be there to be able to take that. So these things go together. So this includes, of course, restructuring of land use in the agricultural sectors as well. And then finally, just focusing on that little tail, or the tail, the production, then you're talking about a world shifting from round about 20% electrification to 50 to 60%. That's a big, big change. Perhaps 40% of primary energy will be from solar and wind, 20% from nuclear and hydro and geothermal, 15% from biofuels and biomass gasification, and about a residual 25% from gas and oil. And so that's a complete turnaround from today in terms of primary energy production and supply, and also effectively tells you that it's a complete turnaround of the consumption sectors and how those are fueled. So if that's not an economic challenge to be thinking about, I don't know what is.
Thank you. John.
Is it off? Push. Okay. Okay. Just to make a couple of points. So on Antoine's point on this issue of education. So like narrowly in these these kind of growth accounting decompositions like John presented, education is meant to go into labour services, so it's meant to be accounted for that way. But what it may leave out, and what it almost certainly does leave out, is the way in which human capital can complement many of the other drivers of productivity. So what, for example, in management practice work, one of the strongest correlates of improved management is the human capital of the workforce, both the managers and the non-managers. A lot of evidence on technology being very complementary with skills. So I do think that we probably underestimate the bigger contribution of human capital more broadly by doing the kind of just looking at the kind of more narrow return to education. And I think that matters in the kind of context of the US or the UK, because as you rightly say, there has been this big increase of inequality. Part of that is, in the US case, as Larry Katz and Claudia Golden show, is the slowdown of the increase of the amount of education people have. And I think that's a particularly worry if many of the people with ability, especially from low-income backgrounds, are not getting access to the educational resources they could have. And some work with Raj Chatty I've been doing recently has shown that if you look at innovators, so take all of the kind of 1.2 million inventors who've got a patent in the US, we've matched them into the tax records, and we've looked at what makes an inventor. And one of the most startling and worrying things is that, if you were born to a wealthy family, your chances of growing up to becoming an inventor are, if you're 10 times greater than if you were born in the bottom 50%. And so that's a potentially large loss of talent and therefore productivity to the American economy and other economies. And, we show that the main route by which that's happening is that low-income kids from low-income families don't get access to good schools and good training opportunities that the richer families have. So I do think that this nexus between human capital and productivity is the kind of key thing, both in terms of thinking of inequality and thinking of potential growth.
Like my colleagues, I'll focus on 2 points. One, sort of responding to Antoine, but also to Carolyn and Wendy so Antoine on measurement and Carolyn and Wendy on maybe it is more cyclical. And as I said, my own personal both gut instinct and wish going into this, not today, but going into this period, was that a lot of it was cyclical. And I think one piece of that would be a piece of mismeasurement that parallels some of the things we didn't talk about, but we talked about but didn't get to today, which is the issue of pro-cyclicality of productivity and services. And I think, Larry made some good examples of mismeasuring, we don't have the level of welfare right or a general price deflator problem. But I mean, we used to talk about this in the middle of the crisis. If you're the UK, okay, and you go down any high street, as we call it, and you see real estate agents. If you went down the high street and you saw the real estate agents in 2005, they would be doing 10 sales a week at whatever level they were doing for 40 hours and doing very well. If you walk down that same street in 2010, they were doing 2 sales a week. They haven't changed their technology. They haven't changed their skills. They haven't changed anything. But it shows up in the data as a huge decline in productivity because that's how we measure these things. Now, the real estate agent on spec is an extreme case, but there does seem to be something to the fact that maybe part of the reason the UK productivity rate is so much worse hit than, say, a German is that the UK is so heavily services dependent in a way that the German economy was not. And so, again, to go back the other way, I think there is room for thinking intelligently about mismeasurement, and that I think the more you think about it, the more it puts you into a more sympathetic to the cyclical side of explanation. The final thing I would say is just in response to Sir David. You know, the massive, there's sort of 2 ways to think about this. And it's like you jokingly said, you had your list of 10 initiatives or 12 initiatives, which is even longer than my list of 10 questions. You know, and if it was in Japan, and Kyoji knows this well, it would be a list of 45 initiatives from the government in each area. So on the one hand, we have things like Danny Roderick's new book, which tells us don't try to go for gesamt concepts. Don't try to go for overarching things. Think about the specific situation, work it through, do this. And this goes with things that Shebnem was saying about, and others will point to, about the accumulation of particular market imperfections and barriers. And of course, that's the work Jacob Kierkegaard did years ago with Martin Bailey on European growth, and the Center for Economic Performance has dealt with that. Okay. There is a lot of virtue to that. But at the 35,000-foot level, there is a problem that almost every country in the OECD looks better on those metrics of liberalization now than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I know I'm not attacking you on this. I'm just saying it's something we have to wrestle with. So why should that be coincident with a productivity thing? You can make a case perhaps that, say, patent troll, patent squatting in the highest tech industries and property rights for the, you know, the Googles and the Apples and how assiduously they protect them, maybe it moved us backwards, and that fits a lot with Daniel's view of low diffusion from the high firms to low firms. But there is this, I do have this general concern that while I can sit down in any country with an expert of that country and come up with your list, and as Peter Orszag said, in the US it's healthcare, but in the broad, it is a more liberalized, more competitive economy now than it was 20 years ago, so why are we doing worse?
All right. Well, please join me in thanking not only our panelists, but all the participants from sessions earlier today. I think it's been a very interesting. And I congratulate you to sticking through to the bitter end, and I hereby declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you.